You are listening to the I Choose My Best Life podcast with Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith, a show that is dedicated to helping you live fully, love boldly, and rest intentionally. For additional resources, visit ichoosemybestlife.com.
If you are feeling overwhelmed and in need of a break, I want to invite you on an experience like no other. This is our very first Rest and Renew cruise. It is happening January 16th through the 20th, 2025, aboard a luxurious, beautiful ship with Royal Caribbean. Imagine yourself sailing through turquoise waters with nothing but relaxation on the schedule. This isn't just a vacation. This is a water-bound rest retreat where you get an opportunity to reclaim your peace, enjoy worship sessions, inspiring workshops, and the delicious cuisine and locations that you'll experience on our adventure together. You get to indulge in some restorative activities based on the type of rest that you personally need to restore your body, mind, and spirit. Spaces are limited, so make sure you book your cabin now. You get the opportunity to choose if you want to have a private room or if you want to have a double room and share with your friends. We have all of this set up within our online system so you can secure your spot today before we close down registration on September 1st, 2024. So to get signed up, check out the link that is over in the show notes. And I can't wait to see you on the Rest and Renew cruise. Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Saundra, and you're listening to I Choose My Best Life. Today, we're going to be talking about infidelity. How do you heal and get back to a place of trust when that has been broken within your marriage? I'm chatting today with Jill Savage, and we're going to go deep into this conversation and help you get back on track with a healthy marriage, even one that is not perfect. So, Jill, welcome to the podcast. And I want to start by just giving you a chance to share a little bit about your journey. How did this become a topic that you started to write about?
I wish that I didn't have to write about it. I wish that I had no experience with that. And that is, I think, the heart's desire for both my husband and myself. But in reality, it was a part of our imperfect story. And we all have an imperfect story. We all struggle. But Mark and I say that we've been married 41 years, 31 of them happily. And it's not that there were 10 bad years in a row. It's that there were bumps, there were difficult seasons here and there, and we would maybe get some help. We'd do a little bit of counseling, and then we'd get back on track, and then we'd hit another hard season. When we say, 10 rough years, we just mean over those 41 years, there's been some difficult seasons, and I think that's representative for almost everyone. We all have difficult seasons in the relationships that mean the most to us. But it was 12 years ago when my husband went into a really deep, dark place. He had left the career he'd been in for 20 years, thought that he really needed a break from that. And when he established himself as a businessman, he did a construction company and began to do home repair. He thought, this is going to be the break that I need. But in reality, he was really attached to that title, that job title he'd had before, and he didn't realize how much he was. Not only that, he was carrying a lot of childhood pain that had not really been worked through. And we didn't know that. We knew he struggled with depression and anxiety, but we just didn't understand the depth of what was going on inside of him and the lies that he was believing. And in the midst of that, of course, I brought my own junk in the trunk, because we all do. And so my junk in the trunk mixed with his junk in the trunk. So that entered us into a really dark year. When I asked God, what do I do? What do I do? I don't know what to do. I begged God, tell me what to do. And I heard one thing. And it wasn't like a voice out of heaven, but it was like this thought that came to my head that I knew wasn't my own because it completely was the opposite of what I was feeling. And I heard God say to me, I want you to love him. And I remember where I was, Saundra, in that moment. I was in our family room. I was face down on the floor. The carpet was wet from my tears. And I remember standing up and looking up at heaven thinking, and I said, God, I'm sorry, but I don't know if you've noticed, but he's not very lovable right now. And I heard the Lord whisper back to my heart, and sometimes you aren't either, Jill. And I was like, okay, God, you love me when I'm unlovable. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to love someone who isn't loving me back. Like I know easy love. I don't know hard love. I don't know what unconditional love really looks like in that way. I'll tell you, you start taking lessons from God's word. And eventually, God took me to Romans 12, 9 through 21. And it was a game changer for me. It taught me how to begin to love in a very practical way. So one of the things it says in Romans 12, and this is specifically in verse 10, it says, outdo one another in showing honor. It doesn't even say where honor is due, where honor is earned. It says outdo one another in showing honor. And I was like, oh my gosh, Lord, okay, here's my first step. How do I honor my husband in my language, in the words that I speak to him, in the way that I even think about him? How do I begin to honor him? And as I began to walk that out, like I began to realize, oh, wait a minute. I have a call to love that maybe this is where it becomes difficult, but I can do it because of God. And it's a call from his word. Here is another one. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. I was definitely feeling very persecuted during that season of life. And so I began to think of what are ways that I can bless Mark. And I'm not talking about going overtly out of my way. It was like the tiniest of things. It was little things that would maybe I bit my tongue. And quite frankly, one of the places I knew that I had some junk in the trunk was I had a critical spirit in our marriage. So one of the things I say is when we speak on this and when we talk openly about it is I didn't cause my husband's infidelity, but I contributed to the dysfunction in our marriage. And I had to be willing to look at that. And as that continues to go on, at the end of Romans 12, verse 21, it says, actually, verse 20, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. For by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And I shared that with my husband after he came home, after he had his surrender, after he made a U-turn. I shared that this was because he said to me one day, Jill, how have you treated me so kindly when I've treated you so poorly? And I didn't do it perfectly, but I was becoming characterized by love. And so I read this to him and he said, when I got to if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. For by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. And Mark said, you did that. And I said, I did what? He said, you heaped burning coals on my head. I said, Mark, I don't even know what that part of the verse means. He said, you treated me better than I deserve to be treated. That's love. And so that became the journey that God took me on during that really dark season.
I think that's so beautiful. Just starting with just the honor because I think that's what's missing oftentimes in marriage. We talk about love and we get more wrapped up in an emotion and a feeling and an image of what love is and how it should look. And TV and romance novels and all those things don't actually help our image very much. They warp it, if anything, about what love
Yes.
means. And when we take a step back and look at a scriptural definition of what it looks like to love, the sacrifices that are part of it, the humility that's a part of it, the honor that's a part of it, it's completely different. How would you help a couple or someone who is listening to this who has some of those unrealistic expectations about what love and marriage should be? And those unrealistic expectations are actually what's making the grass look greener necessarily on the other side. How do we
You know,
navigate that?
yeah, that would be it was exactly what my husband talks about was his journey, because his journey was just filled with unrealistic expectations. And when you have unrealistic expectations, you have a space in between the unrealistic expectations and reality. And that space is filled with discontentment. And so, what we have to do is we have to better match our expectations to reality. And so, one of the things that we have, a lot of times people are like, how do I know I have unrealistic expectations? And usually, what I have learned is that the best way to figure that out is in whom or in what are you constantly disappointed? Where are you constantly let down? You probably have some expectations that are not matching reality. And so, what we have to do is we have to get our expectations to better match reality. What is real? Like a lot of times, even in marriage, if I have an expectation that my husband, it's interesting. Mark and I talk a lot about differences. Mark is a feeler, I'm a thinker. If I want him to operate in this world from a position of data and logic and facts, that's going to be an unrealistic expectation. It's not how God wired him. My husband operates in this world by gut and intuition and emotion. And so I have to expect that because that's how he's wired. And then he has to expect from me that I'm going to be looking for data and logic and facts. And this even comes out in the silliest of things, like buying a car. Okay, Mark gets in a car that we're like test driving, and it's all about how it feels to him. I get in a car that we're test driving, and I want to know the mileage. How many miles per gallon does it get? I want to know all of the data and the facts. And used to, we were critical of each other for those differences. Now we embrace those differences and we recognize, you know what? I'm never going to turn him into a guy that immediately is looking for the data. That's not how he's wired. He's not going to turn me into a gal that cares about how it feels. But together, we make really good decisions when we honor the way that God has wired each of us, because we make better decisions together because we've got a thinker and a feeler that put their experiences and their strengths on the table. And when we begin to honor that in each other, what a difference that makes in our marriage. And we're not criticizing each other anymore. We don't have unrealistic expectations of each other anymore. We are accepting the way that God has wired us.
I think that's such an important point in most marriages is the thing that makes you actually work together and complement each other is that you are individuals with your own gifts and talents and strengths and weaknesses. And because oftentimes we're attracted to somebody who complements us, it also means that they have such differences that they're almost weird to us in some
Yes.
way. It's like, why don't you think like me? But that is the beauty of that connection, of that coming together, is that it actually helps to bring together your partner's strengths that may be your weaknesses in a way that you can function more fully. And one of the things I think that's hard, however, with infidelity and broken trust in any way is that trust eventually has to be rebuilt to move forward, to actually grow again together instead of growing apart. How did you forgive Mark after that situation?
Yeah. You're exactly right. And it is a journey. It is a journey. I think a lot of times people that are dealing with broken trust in some way in a relationship want, maybe they were the one that broke the trust. And what they want to do is they want to say, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I won't ever do it again. And then they want you to just forget about it and move on. And that's not the way that rebuilding trust works. Because rebuilding trust, there's actually a formula for rebuilding trust, and that is consistent change behavior over time equals trust. And so a lot of times people struggle with forgiveness, and they struggle with it because they're like, if I forgive, then I'm going to have to trust. And what forgiveness opens the door for trust to be rebuilt. But in and of itself, it doesn't rebuild trust. It just unclutters your heart and makes your heart available for trust to be built and available to God again. Because when we are hurting and offense fills our heart, it is difficult for us to be available to a relationship, and it's difficult for us to even be available to God because our heart's all cluttered. And so forgiveness is the act of uncluttering our heart. And I like to think of it, and I had to do this so many times, Saundra. I had to take what was in my heart and I had to hand it to the Lord. Lord, I'm not going to carry this anymore. You've got to carry this. And a lot of times people think that forgiveness is what happens horizontally between me and another person. But really, forgiveness is what happens vertically between me and the Lord. And amends and rebuilding trust happens horizontally between me and another person. But that forgiveness piece, it's a God piece that says, I've got to unclutter my heart. And what I learned, and I had to do this over and over again, is especially in infidelity and broken trust, forgiveness is layered. It's not just once and done. I don't just forgive you for the fact that you had an affair or the fact that you broke my trust. I had to probably forgive 100 to 150 different angles of that hurt. For instance, I had to forgive the misuse of money during that season of time. I had to forgive the specific ways that he put me at a health risk. I had to forgive the betrayal, not only of me, but of our kids, and ways that he lied to them during that season of time. And so all of those had to be worked through and processed and forgiven so that my heart could truly become uncluttered. And that was probably one of my biggest lessons I learned about forgiveness.
I love how you describe that because I think that also helps us to see how we forgive ourselves. As you mentioned, you weren't necessarily the cause of his infidelity, but you do see where some of your own actions may have added to that situation coming to what it was. And so, even in the forgiving of yourself, when
Yeah,
you think about it as more of a vertical relationship, your relationship with God and receiving that forgiveness really starts with that relationship with him.
it
I
really does.
I love how you then extrapolated into that to include the children because what age were your kids when all of this happened? Were they still at home or were they like grown-ups when this happened?
Both. So we had 3 that were out of the house. They were in their 20s. And then we had 2 that were still at home. And the 3 that were in their 20s, they were all married. And then 2 that were still at home that were 15 and 17 at the time. All of them heartbroken, just heartbroken. It was very difficult. We even had a granddaughter and a new grandson that was born in the midst of this. Our granddaughter, who was little at the time, but very confused. Where's Papa? Because eventually Mark's separated. And that was just a really difficult, dark time for our entire family.
So, thinking about that, how do you heal the family unit after an infidelity moment? Because it's one thing for you and your spouse to maybe go to the counseling, spend time with the Lord, spend time talking and discussing this and healing with each other. But then when you bring in these other people, your kids' spouses now in your situation, grandkids, there's a ripple effect in some ways that have now happened. How do you heal the entire family from that situation?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I don't know that it's one that I've ever been specifically asked. But I think that there are some things that are super important. And one is you you pursue restoration with the individuals that were affected. So and I look back on this and I'm so grateful. It is something that Mark did well. And that is that he pursued restoration with each of the kids individually. He went to them, he went to their spouses, he apologized, he asked for their forgiveness. That was a huge part of the healing process for them. And what I will tell you is 3 of them were pretty quick to restore. 2 of them took a much longer time. It was our oldest and our youngest, took a much longer time. The 3 middles restored relatively quickly. And you have to allow for that. People have different healing journeys, and you have to allow for that. And so never once did Mark in any way get angry at the kids that couldn't move beyond it or were still keeping some distance or even a little cynical. In fact, it was really interesting. Our daughter, she was a blogger for a little while, and so she had her own blog and would post on social media quite a bit. And probably 3 years after, maybe 4 years after the infidelity, she put a post on Facebook, and it was a picture of Mark and I holding her her 1-year-old son. And he had been born literally the weekend that Mark made his U-turn and surrendered back to the Lord and broke off the affair, and we began to heal. And she shared this picture and she said, I'm sharing this picture today because I remember the day I took it. It was a year after my dad stopped his affair, came back home, and began to restore. And I remember taking the picture a year later thinking, you know what, Mom, stop trying so hard. He's just going to leave again. And she said, but here we are 4 years later. And I just want to say, Dad, I'm so proud of you. You stuck through it. You really did become a man of your word, and you have rebuilt my trust. And I think that says so much because it wasn't just what needed to happen in our marriage. It needed to happen with his kids as well.
I'm thankful for you and Mark for the boldness and the transparency of sharing your journey, because I think it's so helpful for so many marriages to just see, just as you actually have a book titled this, there are no perfect marriages. But even when you go through difficult seasons like this, there is still hope for restoration, that God still has a path to bring that union back into covenant and back into a healthy place. And one of the things you state is that we can have a 2.0 marriage. What does
Yeah.
that mean? And how do you now help other couples get to that place?
Yeah. That became some language that we just started using for ourselves because when Mark made his U-turn, we didn't want to go back to what we had. We knew we wanted something new. And so we both had to begin to take a look at our junk in the trunk, what we brought in an unhealthy way, in a dysfunctional way to the marriage. And I like to say that marriage restoration is about 70% personal growth and about 30% couple growth. And so we began that personal growth and becoming, so we have a 2.0 marriage because there's now Jill 2.0 and there's Mark 2.0. And Jill 2.0 is very careful with her words. Jill 2.0 is no longer avoidant. That was, I don't know if you're familiar with attachment styles, but in what we learned is in our marriage, I brought the avoidant attachment and Mark brought the anxious attachment. And we've both worked really hard to move to secure attachment. Our 2.0 marriage is really created because we became 2.0 people. And then we learned some different skills for communication and conflict resolution and things that we didn't have in our 1.0 marriage. And so eventually, as we shared our story, God began to open the door for us to help other couples. We knew the path to rebuild trust. And 7 years ago, we actually began to coach marriages. And 4 years ago, we moved to doing that full time. And so now we have our Marriage 2.0 ministries, and we do Marriage 2.0 coaching. We offer Marriage 2.0 intensives where we work with one couple at a time on the weekends. So they come to our home, they stay in our home. We work with them Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It's about a year's worth of coaching in one weekend because we stay in the zone and we help them to understand the dynamics that are playing out and then what to do differently. And it has been an absolute joy. We have an online course called the Rebuilding Trust course. And all of that has just become our life's work because God's taken our pain and turned it into his purpose. And we're so grateful for that.
We've been chatting with Jill Savage. She and her husband, Mark, have co-authored the book, No More Perfect Marriages. They also have a restoration series where Jill has authored a book, My Heart is Broken, and Mark has authored a book, I Really Messed Up, to really address this from the different angles so that regardless of where you're at in an infidelity situation, there's books together and then separate books that kind of address the situation. I would love for you, Jill, to just speak to that person who may be listening right now and who may have just got the news that you got so many years ago that their spouse has stepped outside of their marriage. And whether it's a physical affair or now with social media, we have emotional affairs, which are the same as far as the feelings that we have. What would you say to that person right now who really does feel like their heart is broken?
Yeah. I would say to them, your God understands you because he was betrayed. You know, when Jesus was betrayed he experienced what that feels like. And so you don't have a God that is distant. You have a God that truly is a friend who understands, and he will walk you through this. His word will be your guide. But I also want you to know that it's okay to be heartbroken. You have to grieve. But what's important is that we let that grieving eventually take us to a place of growth. And so for right now, if it's fresh, surround yourself, get help, surround yourself with people that love you and care for you. Get help. Don't try to do this alone. And then if your spouse is willing to do the work to restore trust, get help doing that as well. But more than anything, trust that God's got you. And I would also encourage, especially if your spouse is willing, but we have a free Rebuilding Trust resource. And you just find that at rebuildingtrust.us, rebuildingtrust.us. And it's a free guide to rebuilding trust. And you can get it in two different versions. One is if only one person's ready, and one is if both of you are ready. And it gives you some insight for both of those settings.
Excellent. And I want to make sure people know how to get in touch with you. So the best website for them to connect
is markandjill.org.
That's super simple. markandjill.org. And we will link to the resource that she just mentioned about rebuilding trust, as well as to her book, so that you'll be able to really connect and go deeper into this area, because God is a fan of covenant, and marriage is the ultimate covenant. And so regardless of where you may be at in this journey, whether you are a honeymooning couple where everything is beautiful, or if you're in the thick of it right now after something like Jill has just described, there is healing, there is hope, and there is a process God wants to take us all on to his best life for us and our spouses. Jill, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Saundra. I appreciate it.
Until next time, everyone, live fully, love boldly, and rest intentionally.